Welcome, everyone. Dr. Thor here, and let's talk about an important issue. And, it's amazing how history of the past affects us today, and people should take note of these things. What's coming up is Friday the 13th, which has been labeled as the fear of Friday the 13th is tridecaphobia, which means the fear of the number 13. But the bottom line is that this signifies the day that the usurping by the evil forces of the Middle East entered into Europe to take out the one protectors of that, and that was the Knights Templar. Now, there's a long history of the Knights Templar who fought for over 200 years, preserving the Christian European city of Jerusalem that was occupied by them, that was basically in lots of ways founded by them, and of course the Jews before that by 1,000 or so years. But at the time of the Muslim invasion and the murder of Christians, etc., this was a Christian city. There were no countries there. Nobody invaded a country. You have to understand that. But what is the story behind them? Now, the real story has never been told. You're now going to get the real story of the suppression of the Knights Templar, which in recent history has come out that even the German popes, we've had two popes that are all Germans. Before that, they were all controlled by Germans as well. And when the Pope didn't cooperate in World War II, they murdered him and brought in someone else, so typically German. So the whole idea is that, and now we had a Pope before this last one. Francis, of course, is an Argentinian, otherwise known as Little Germany, where there's entire cities in Argentina that look like Europe, and the country has been run by the Germans for many years. And of course, they even were building a nuclear bomb down there. And of course, the cowardice, worthless allies, particularly the Americans, allowed them to do that. From Argentina, all through that area, including places like Chile, who still are marching like and have German World War II uniforms and helmets. You can see that in the Chilean army. All you got to do is punch in Surapedia. So the whole idea is you can see all that. Now, the Latins throughout all these areas, including Brazil, were murdered, and giant millions of people were murdered. That's been covered up on the takeover of these countries that were done. Particularly Chile has entire communities that are dedicated to the Nazis, some, and have festivals and everything else on Hitler's birthday, etc. There also was connected to lots of pedophilia activity as well. How typical of all this as it is filtered back. Now, without getting into that history of all those things as well, but we do have to understand the fact that Pope Francis was a guy who turned in priests and other people, and 30,000 people disappeared in Argentina, and they were assisted in this disappearance by Pope Francis. Now, before Pope Francis was a self-avowed German Nazi youth person. So, these are the kind of things, and I don't really care what your problem is with society you come from. The fact that the church would allow this person to be appointed really tells you who's in control of it. And we all know who's in control of it. Or at least I know. You're probably delusionally thinking. So we got to understand that, and of course, the entire Catholic Church is just an abomination with its crimes, its infiltration, etc. So this was a made-up church by the Romans to control people, and of course, it's like all religions, really the base of the base. And the Vatican has trillions of dollars, and they don't do anything with it but support their criminal backgrounds, and they're bending over as they've always done. Never hear a word of them talking about Islam. You'll never hear them a word of talking everything else when they run around in their little Islamic garbs and are just identical to Middle Eastern traditions. But of course, that's what happens when you get infected with that. So, but what really happened there? Now, what happened with the Knights Templar is a long story, and I'll try and give it to you in the 2 cents version of it. Now, for years, the West, of course, Europe, particularly the French, who were the first very wealthy French, heard the call of what was happening to Jerusalem, And they gave up their entire lifestyle, most of their wealth and everything else, and ran over there to fight. So this was not something that anybody made money off of. Your lies told to you by ignoramus, particularly your German Muslim reality that's been shoved down your throat by the criminal teachers in the United States and other places. And still the misinformation goes on and on with all of these things. As it goes through into modern history, into World War I and II, and of course the complete and total Nazification of all of Europe who fought for the Germans except the French, the British, and the Americans. Everybody else was Nazis. And willingly did it, including Iceland, who had to be invaded because they were going to work with the Nazis and use Iceland as a jump-off point, the Nazis, to then attack Europe. So they had to be invaded. And, of course, we gave the other incompetents that job, the Canadians. So this is the reality that is on out there that we all have to have very great understanding of. But there were problems, and because of the fact that ultimately all of the Middle East was lost because of the lack of effort to fight back against Islam's invasion of everything. Now, there's a lack of support for many reasons. There were many crusades. I don't know how many ultimately there were. They went back in to try and save those areas. One of the most notable with the French, Richard the Lion-Hearted, who was a Frenchman. And, of course, most of the Knights Templars were French as well. Of course, they did have different divisions in other places. And, of course, ignorant Americans think that somehow everything was done through the British or the UK people who were prominent as knights. Now, this is all, of course, a great fallacy that nobody understands. More facts you just don't get. I mean, pretty much most of the knights were French, or at least a large percentage of them. Of course, the Templars were a French organization. Castles that you know of as today as these giant structures were brought to England by the Normans, who were basically Norwegians who were settled in France, and then, of course, invaded England, and they brought their stone building culture there. So these are all the facts that you know nothing about, and, of course, nobody cares. After all, your teachers will tell you garbage because they're too busy scoping out the students they want to screw. So the whole idea is that this is the reality that we have that we need to get over. So when we look at it, this apparently happened where the Templars were arrested, at least some of them, in France on Friday the 13th, which is coming up this Friday. And quite fascinating, again, that all this kind of happens together. But this happened based on charges against them, which, of course, were pretty much bogus. The church of today and the popies of today, the little gay freaks they are, have acquitted the Templars, saying that they were not up to anything bad. And most likely they weren't. There was a lot of things. But you got to remember that ancient Christianity at that time, and people that spent hundreds of years in Jerusalem, in the Middle East, learned an awful lot about the fable known as Christianity and the Jesus story. And, of course, they found out, of course, that Jesus was just a disciple of John the Baptist. And, of course, John the Baptist was something that became more venerated. And it's thought that the Templars may have even had his head because he was executed and his head was cut off, and they may have worshipped that. So the fact that ancient Christianity compared to modern Christianity is quite different. And all of this is a reality that we have to look at and understand the bigger picture of what is going on. So we have these kind of situations that we have to look at. But you don't know any history, and the history given to you is pretty poor. So, but there was a problem. The problem becomes when you are wealthy and you establish a money system, and anytime money is involved, you run into further and further problems. It's hard to keep friends in a proper attitude if you have money involved. You probably have hard feelings with people within your family or friends that you gave money to that never returned it. These are all the things that happen. So when you put that on a bigger scale and you're quite wealthy, and I'm not sure why this became a major situation with the Templars instead of the problem is it costs a lot of money to fight wars. But I have a feeling that this ended up. So it seems like there's a little bit too much emphasis on business here, but business is a reality. It's estimated today that it costs $1 million per soldier to keep them in a field outside the United States. So if that's the case, you can imagine the expensiveness of putting it together. Now, the Knights Templar, like all of these religious knightly orders, which there were hundreds of them, little groups from each little city-state in Europe, all needed lots of money. And, of course, knights were rich kids. Unlike the rich kids of today that just steal from you and set up their little companies in the Bahamas, these people actually did something to fight for something, or at least some of them did. So we have this reality that we have to look at. And the problem, plain and simple, is that the Templars had lost the Holy Land. They had lost Crete. They had lost Sicily. So the point is they were all pushed back to Europe and never really had any place that they were holding much of. So it became a point where they really had no use anymore other than turning into the bankers that they did. And of course, as we know, all of life is money and it never has changed. So you can't fight battles, wars, or anything else with having huge amounts of money. So it's always amusing when you see so-called terrorists and other people waving guns around and using missiles and so forth, or you see all this in Africa, or we talk about the growth of countries and other things. It's all based on money. You know, it's amusing to talk about World War I saying that the poor little Germans were starving. Yeah, they didn't have any problem buying lots of weapons, did they, and building weapon factories. Where'd all that money come from? Yeah, they were so starving after World War I. What a joke. So the whole idea is we have to understand that there is also competing factors. This is also when the major contingency of Christendom was still part of the people who ran all of Europe for thousands of years, which were the French. And of course, this was called Germania. All of Europe was Germania because this is what the Roman general had named that entire area. But few people understand that the French were running everything. They pretty much were involved. That's why we have so many countries in Europe that are very French. Belgium, they speak French. So the whole idea is we have the France, which is a fairly large country. And of course, they were basically occupying and running the rest of the world until the rest of Europe, until the fall of Napoleon. Napoleon tried to unify all of Europe, and particularly the one area that was a problem, which was Russia, which he failed to do. And of course, if you want to find out why the Russians aren't too happy with the West, well, what about Napoleon trying to take them over and conquer them? So these are all the things that people want to overlook and just blame the big bad communists when, of course, the story is much more complicated than that. So we basically have this very rich order that continued to be very rich. At the time, the King of France, and I'm not going to get into all the details, maybe something is slightly different, whatever, but the King of France wanted to become part of the Knights Templar, and they refused to bring him in. Of course, that's not a very smart political thing to do. So, also, from what we understand, he owed the Templars a lot of money. And this is where things get, once you start becoming bankers and given and owe money, very hard feelings happening. So the fact of the suppression of the Templars meant that his bill was canceled with the Knights Templar. Very convenient for that person. So the other thing involved in that, of course, is the fact that they didn't want to bring him in, so there's already bad blood there. And the Templars being an elite organization, a lot of people did not like them. Of course, a lot of writers didn't like them. And most of these writers, again, can be traced back to the Deutschlander Germans who wrote this, just like they wrote against Vlad Tepes, otherwise known as Dracula, where the idiot Irish writer Bram Stoker, who got his information from German sources to demonize who is a great hero to Christendom and stop the invasion of the Islamic Turks from taking most of Europe. If it wasn't for him, there'd be all sorts of money. He was a great hero, and you have to deal with vile people and vile ways. So what happened in particular then? So here's all this potentially troublemakers, potentially. There was some talk that the Templars would start their own state, would take control of things. After all, they were an armed personal military. And kind of under control of the weak Pope at that time, which the King of France, we don't know if he was forced into it or whatever happened, but the Pope conveniently was in France at that time and under control of that king at the time, and they were buddies, supposedly. So the Pope came out and condemned the Templars as well. But who was behind all this? And what is there's an old saying in modern times is, you follow the money. And we can follow the money and what was going on there. Now, there were two different military orders, and there were major problems since day one, since the Crusades, that go back hundreds of years. And those are the traitorous Muslim allies, otherwise known as your Hospitallers and your Teutonic Knights. These, again, were German orders working for the criminal Islam. Simple as that. That's their heritage. That's where they came from. There were open battles between these orders and the Knights Templars during the Crusades. They also betrayed the Crusaders in many ends. They were giving information. They had deals with the assassins and other people that they worked with in the Middle East. So this has been going on for, thousands of years now, where we have these kind of traitorous deals being made by basically the European Muslims, otherwise known as Swiss, Germans, etc., and all the people that settled there from Iran, which is where Aryans come from. So this is, of course, what was happening there. So what happened? There was an order. So as I said, there was out-and-out fights, and there was a couple of problems. The Templars, who people want to give a bad reputation to, and who knows what they were doing in their little orders and everything else. All the things they're accused of, I find kind of amusing. After all, they gave their lives in fight. They weren't very, if they believed in some other god, that is quite strange that you're going to be able to fight that way. So, and the fact is they did do that. Now, whether there was all sorts of shenanigans going on, especially because they were French and a little bizarre, and the fact that they were a military order, we really don't know. Certainly, I'm sure all sorts of strange things went on. But ultimately, the Knights Templars themselves were a very ineffective group. They had lots of money, and I'm not sure where all that went to. They did establish the banking system. A lot of people think that Switzerland, which kind of popped out of nowhere because of the help of some unknown military forces, were the Knights Templar, and they established that. Kind of makes a lot of sense. And of course, the country of Switzerland, which basically is nothing more than a Nazi bankers and done nothing else with some of the most criminal companies in the world there. We have to keep all that in mind to understand what's going on in that particular thing as well. So there's a lot of, I'm sure, all sorts of things. Nobody is squeaky clean, and nobody really likes rich people. And they certainly had huge holdings all over Europe, and were basically there was a lot of fear that they would take over things, and like everything else, people were jealous of them, etc. And they made a lot of enemies by loaning money. And one of them, of course, was the King of France, who owed them a lot of money and couldn't pay it back. And was further dished by when somebody comes to you and say, well, we don't want to allow you into the order. Well, this is pretty shocking. Now, there's all sorts of different things that have been discovered in Templar commanderies around the world. And they certainly had their own view of Christianity, I frankly doubt. But as I said, I believe that they were probably heavily involved in the actual honoring or worship of John the Baptist. And of course, the Cistercians were the ones who actually sponsored them to a large degree. And the Cistercians, all of their monasteries and everything else were named after women. They were very feminine order in terms of that because they were basically goddess based, is what it really gets down to. So the whole idea is this happened. Of course, there was always huge amounts of tension. The other thing going on at the time of this was the fact of the oppression of Eastern European pagans, which the Templars weren't too much in favor of doing or wanting to go out and kill a bunch of pagans per se. They were involved to a certain extent with massacring the Cathars, the Gnostics, in France at that time as well, and a certain amount of their participation was there as well. I'm assuming that was forced. How much, I don't know, and I'm not going to spend my time doing that, but researching that. But of course, there was the major push done by, of course, the Teutonic Knights and the Hospitallers, the German orders, to go in there and massacre all the pagan non-Christians, particularly in Eastern Europe. Those are the people who did it. So there was a conflict there because, as I said, the Templars didn't want to do that. And this was a major next move, particularly since they couldn't beat Islam because there really was no will. It's very expensive to do all this stuff. And nobody really had a will, especially since the fact that nobody was able to hold any ground there. But, again, let's remember the Crusades went on for 200 years. The Templars were active for 200 years. Fighting these things all over mostly Europe as the Muslim expansion into taking of Spain, taking of Portugal, even northern Italy to a degree, and so many other places that the Muslim invaders took over and held for 800 years. So we do have to understand all these things as well. So it's not exact that anybody in any way, of course, they took over all North Africa that was not Islam, Algiers, Egypt, etc. All these countries were invaded, the taking of Constantinople, etc. All of these were taken by the Islamic expansion at the end of the sword. So we have to understand that. And of course, apparently, the weak-kneed Europeans, particularly the influence coming from the Arabic Europeans who settled in Central Europe, what are considered the Deutschlanders, as they call themselves today, or as considered in the poorly stated Germanics, which doesn't really, as I said, has absolutely nothing to do with Germany. The Italian general, the Roman general, Germani, is the person who conquered all this area, which eventually was ruled by the Franks, otherwise known as the French, who did all this until Napoleon was defeated, mostly because of the Islamic German troops that supported their buddies and pals at the Battle of Waterloo, meaning the Brits, who invaded Europe and thought they owned part of the continental Europe, and so forth. I believe Waterloo was is it in Belgium? I'm trying to remember now. But so a lot of people think that's some sort of place in England that the British were trying to push the French out. This is not true, and the British have always claimed land in continental Europe, and that's what the 100-Year War was about. But that's other areas of history, if those of you who want to know the truth out there. So the bottom line is this is what happened with what was going on there. So that particular day, and of course everybody knew what was going on again. The Templars' fleet disappeared. Their treasures, which they had of all of their commanderies around Europe, all the stuff was taken. Very few actual physical items, if any, were grabbed any place. They certainly didn't find any gold or other things. And there were no physical evidence of any of the perversions that they were accused of doing per the Catholic Church in any of their commanderies. They didn't find any skulls, any rituals. Not a shred of evidence was ever brought against the Templars in physical reality other than statements made by the people they horribly tortured. So they got confessions of some degree, and a lot of this has been confused, of the fact of what's going on. But they held these, I don't know how many years was it, but they tortured these groups of people they arrested, including the commander, who they slowly roasted alive like a pig on a spit. He wasn't even burned at the stake. From what I understand, they were roasted. Um, so all of that is part of this torture that was done to them. And of course, then people confess. But this is not really true. In the end, when they were eventually going to murder them, every single Templar revoked, denied their under forced torture so-called statements. So every one of them said, no, I only said that under torture. So it just shows you the kind of tough, dedicated group this was, that nobody really went along with this. Now, most of the other trials that were out there that did in other countries, who again were trying to take back the power and worried about them creating their own states, almost nobody was convicted of it. Very few places, I believe in a few places in England or so, but there was really not much done, and I don't believe there are many executions or anywhere else. So this was definitely done to the order backed by the Pope that was done mostly in France, while other people were arrested in other countries as well. Of course, they arrested them in Germany, and of course in places of England. So what happened there is that, but let's get back to the coup de grace here before this can go on, because I could talk about this for hours. But, the old saying of follow the money. Now, the bottom line is, interestingly enough, the King of France did not benefit by grabbing the assets of the Templars, which is very interesting. Here he's the king, he needs money. Of course, his credit card bill was canceled, which, of course, was very important to him. He was killed a year later in what basically was an assassination, claiming to be a hunting accident. Yeah, right. But the bottom line is, where did all the money go to? And of course, you have all the Templars as well. So a lot of the Templars, of course, were not going to work for anybody else. So a lot of things happened. There's a lot of stories that maybe this was who became pirates with their fleets and everything. So you had a lot of renegade military that certainly weren't going to join the other orders. But what happened is the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, interestingly enough, got all their assets, all their troops, everything. So the whole idea is, you've got thousands of Templars here, and they were taken in, and their assets, they had to go somewhere and do something with all that. And as I said, oddly enough, it appears that from what we can tell, what a maybe, supposing if, or what the polluted history that we get from the bogus, idiot, moron teachers, apparently all their assets went to that. So the king didn't get it, other than having his credit card bill canceled, which certainly was a great benefit to him. Went to the Teutonic orders. So all of their properties, which were amassed, I don't know how much physical money was able to be grabbed. Apparently there wasn't much of that, nor was there any treasure that was grabbed per se either. This may have been grabbed by the later group of Teutonic Middle Eastern Knights, otherwise known as the Nazi Germans, who went into caves and so forth and may have gotten some stuff they found in different areas. We just don't know, because all that's still covered up to this day, as they're still finding treasures and other things all over Germany in particular that have been hidden away for 70 years that everybody knows about, but rarely get popped up anywhere until it becomes an issue that they have no choice. But the bottom line is, all those resources went to the Teutonic Knights, so they could then kill the pagans in Eastern Europe in particular. So all the money, all the troops and everything. I'm not sure how many Templar troops would fight with the people that they've been fighting with to begin with in the Holy Land, where they had open battles with the Hospitallers and other ones. So this is no joke. And of course, you don't hear about that either. So it's very interesting, you find the money. So who was really behind all this? Who pushed this issue? Who wanted to get rid of people that were not under the control, that basically had foreign religions from them? You're talking about the typical Middle European Muslims, the Swiss, the Germans, the Austrians, and all their other little buddies and pals that are there. Those are the ones that benefited from it, and they wanted to kill the Christians, otherwise known as the French, the Knights Templar, etc. So this is what happened in that instance. So all their wealth, all of that went there. And as I said, I find it hard to believe that a lot of these, especially dedicated knights, would have joined. A lot of people, as I said, think they formed Switzerland, they went to Scotland, and they spread around in different areas. And of course, the Templar orders were maintained in certain countries, like in Portugal, where they renamed themselves the Knights of Christ. So we've got to understand that there must be a huge number of knights must have fled to Portugal, where they were not persecuted, and just changed their name. How convenient. Okay, so a lot of these things get on, but what is the emphasis? Who started all this in the end? Well, it was a lot of factors ultimately, but we have to understand that this plot against Europe and Western thought and Western religions and Western belief systems are all part of this very large force against them. And this is all coming from the hostile, evil bases of the Middle East, which have pushed their way, forming the illegal country of Turkey, which was owned by Christians, Constantinople, the Rome of its time. And this an entire country was there. This, of course, was fed by, and of course, the treaties made and the working with the Central European Muslims, the Swiss, the Germans, the Austrians, etc. No matter what they want to play games and the multi-infiltration from the other countries around them. But you got to remember that Scandinavia basically is another Muslim tribe. They just look a little different. But they have the same type of attitudes, the same type of negative people, and they basically all work together. But there's a certain different tribal factor there, particularly in the ways they look and their height and everything else. And of course, they invaded so many other places all through Europe. We know the stories of the, quote, Vikings, and you don't really know the stories. As I said, they attacked Paris, and they were given a Normandy, or otherwise known as Norway. It was renamed that and occupied that part of France as they still do today. And that's what the ancestors are. And you'll see that people from Normandy in France are very big people. So it obviously was not the pretty stunted growth that you have from the French and the Germans, particularly at that time. So this is where it all comes through, and this is the bigger picture. And don't think that this is over. We also have to understand that the number one birth rate out there is Islam. They are having more children than anybody. They will be the number one group of people in India in another 20 or 30 years. Most Islamic people live in Asia. It's another thing that people don't understand. So they have huge Islamic communities in Asia. They have them in Eastern Europe, etc. These are all the people that are causing all these problems today. So this is a big, big problem that's been going on for thousands of years. The next move here, the next 50 to 100 years, is this forming together of an Islamic-based group of people to take over Europe again, eliminate the Russians, eliminate the Americans. Of course, they're going to get the Americans to fight the Russians. How typical of these little tricksters and thinkers there, because that's exactly what they're trying to set up here. When it's the Russians who've saved the world on numerous occasions, and of course, won World War II without a question. So people just don't get that. Certainly wasn't the pathetic Allied forces. And we've got to keep all these things in mind. This is the bigger picture that's going on. Now, how this affects your life directly is hard to say, but this is where the world is going, and all these little factors add up. All the money that has been poured from the Central European Muslims into Russia, which they still support. It's a complicated little backstabbing, tricky story that's going on, which I will detail in my further parts of the Middle Eastern influence on Western culture. And that story will be documented more so people understand what's going on there. But this is what's happening right now, and all the troubles of the world are created by these particular groups who are starting the wars, attacking the West, and these are the people that will attack the West. How are they going to get everybody out of their little turd country? Is that, of course, they're going to make sure that their Muslim brothers, their cousins, the people they intermarry with by the tens of thousands, that the entire country is 40% Muslim. All of this is part of the plan in the next 100 years to take over. You add into that one of the highest birth rate in the world, while most of the world is having less and less children. And there's even a population crisis to a degree, because the young people have to pay for all the freeloading old people because the system was set up that way. Really bad system. So people have been screaming to reduce populations. When populations are reduced strictly for financial reasons, nobody can afford to have kids. There's no facilities, there's no housing, there's no nothing. And for years, Europeans have been paying people to have children. This goes on everywhere because of the crash of, because nobody wants to, or a lot of people just can't afford to have children. But there's also people are not that interested in it. It takes a lot of fun money away. So as this happens, and we combine all this together with the huge birth rate that will take over India, and of course they're growing in population in China as well, and as they're growing everywhere, particularly in Asian countries like Malaysia, which are almost entirely Muslim, and many other countries, and they're filtering all around Asia, and they will have more influence in all of those areas. And these, we talk about some of the atrocities done now, but particularly in Malaysia, they have cut off the heads of many Christian children, which has been going on for years. So this is nothing new. This is the future, and nobody gives a damn or will do anything about it. Remember, there are no innocents in the world. Everybody supports whatever structure they are connected to, whether that's directly or indirectly, but every American supports the American military by paying their tax dollars. Now, the bottom line is they have to do that because you're required to by law, but the bottom line is it still doesn't matter doing it. So the whole idea is that's what's happening with all these areas, and particularly what's happening in the world with the massive birth rate that all of these Muslims have, the huge intermixing. Finally, the Germans are uniting with their true blood, which is Islam, and there's a huge amount of actual interbreeding going on in Germany in particular. So you see it all over the place. These are one people, and they are joining together. German women love Muslim men who mistreat them, and easily they love to be dominated by this kind of energy. The other half of the women, the German women, generally are dykes, and they are homosexuals, which is a huge part of the population as well. So you have all these problems that are in the bigger picture that few people talk about. So we have all the problems involved with this that are not covered by the regular media or understood. You're brainwashed with all this. You buy all the German food by Aldi, Lidl, and Trader Joe's that own 5% of the U.S. food market. You buy all their cars and all their garbage out there, while none of your products get anywhere else in the world. This is the way it works. And of course, they'll jump into any industry that's really profitable and then try and take it over, pretty much stating their false incompetency, the disorganized, horrible place that Germany is, by saying the fact that they are the big producers and know how to do everything. It's all a con, people. You have no idea what's going on, and of course, you never will. While all of you sit in stupid idiot land supporting people that are going to cut your throat, and that's exactly what's going to happen, and your military will support them. It's as simple as that. The military is a screwed up, infected group of losers who bring their enemies into their bases and support them with billions of dollars. So this is a pretty sad situation, and we run into all these problems as we, as Americans, pay the bill for NATO, and they don't pay anything, yet they're so rich. The bottom line is they never paid their proper amount, and they never will, and when they need anything, they run to us. And we have weak-kneed little cowards, these idiots that claim to be social democrats in America that basically support a bunch of warmongers. And instead of saying, well, look, Ukraine is the problem of Europe, you pay the bill, we refuse to do that. Our military industrial complex, who makes a fortune off of all these wars, runs the government, and particularly all these liberal peaceniks that are out there that support war. So it's a complicated subject, and everybody should be well aware of the potential what's coming. You've been warned. I warned you before with Netanyahu coming to Germany to talk about what the war is that's going on right now. I can tell you right now, that's what was being talked about. They knew damn well of the buildup there, and they know who the hell was helping them. So it's all there. Time to wake up. I frankly doubt any of you will get this. You won't understand the reality of what's going on, and you don't do that to your own personal peril.